A lone biologist dives deep into the Peruvian jungle to find his missing wife and daughter, only to uncover an international organ trafficking network targeting innocent children. Who's behind it? Why is the government silent? And what's in the final video that shook global intelligence to its core? This isn't just a rescue mission, it's a father's war against a hidden empire. Don't miss a single second. Hit that subscribe button now to follow the world's darkest cases and unlock exclusive content and upcoming surprises. The phone buzzed on a desk littered with research papers. Inside the cluttered molecular biology lab, Ethan Monroe looked up to see his wife's name flashing, Sarah. My love. A smile flickered across his face until he opened the message. It vanished the moment he read 3 chilling lines. We're lost. Someone is watching us. Please save us. His entire body went rigid, eyes locked on the screen. He reread the words, hoping he'd misread them. But no, each word hit like a blade through the chest. Sarah and their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, were on a short wilderness trip in northern Peru. A brief getaway before summer's end. Ethan couldn't go. He was tied up with meetings at the South American Science Institute. He had kissed them goodbye at the airport just 2 days earlier, promising I'll fly over in 3 days. And now all he had was this haunting message from an untraceable location. He called back instantly. No signal. Again and again. The only response was a cold beep, then the dead tone. His hand trembled. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out every other sound. His mind raced with the darkest possibilities. He stormed into the tech lab. With internal clearance, he pulled GPS logs for Sarah's phone. One red dot blinked on the screen deep inside the rainforest near the Peru-Brazil border, a zone notorious for satellite interference. The locals called it El Silencio, the silence. This can't be right, Ethan muttered. Sarah had no reason to be anywhere near that region. Their plan was to camp near an eco-reserve over 80 kilometers away. This location wasn't even on their itinerary. He printed the map, marked the coordinates, and immediately contacted the U.S. Embassy in Lima. The voice on the other end was cautious. We need 24 hours to coordinate with local authorities before classifying this as an official missing persons case. Ethan snapped, I don't need protocol. I need action. They're in danger. But the call was cut off with a hollow click. No more waiting. He raced to the director's office, handed in a sudden leave of absence, and packed only what he could carry, a small backpack with basic clothes. Satellite GPS emergency medical gear, and an old licensed handgun from his Army medical advisory days. He didn't know what he was walking into, only that he had to. The flight from Los Angeles to Lima took nearly 8 hours. To Ethan, every minute stretched like a lifetime. Those 3 lines replayed in his head over and over. We're lost. Someone is watching us. Please save us. The last line, save us, echoed like a cry from beyond. On the plane, he opened the last photos Sarah had sent Emma, laughing by a stream. A short video of her blowing bubbles in the forest. He pressed his hand to his chest, trying to cling to that last bit of warmth before diving into the unknown. He landed in Lima after midnight. No one was waiting. The city bustled, but it felt cold and indifferent, like his pleas were dissolving into a crowd of strangers. At the hotel, he tried calling Sarah again, still no signal. He texted her instead, I'm here. If you're alive, reply. Then sat in silence. The next morning, he found Jorge Morales, a former Peruvian soldier. An old acquaintance, Jorge, now working in rural rescues, was stocky, quiet, and blunt. After hearing the story, he just exhaled and said, if they're being followed in El Silencio, time is running out. I'll find them, Ethan said, jaw clenched. Even if I have to tear through the jungle? They began preparing. Jorge's contacts in forest patrol had reported strange activity along the border, sporadic gunshots, shadowy figures in the night. Locals whispered about los recolectores de sombras, shadow harvesters rumored to abduct people for trafficking networks. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He remembered rejecting a research proposal years ago that studied illegal organ extraction in South America. He'd dismissed it as speculative fiction, but now the nightmare was real. He glanced once more at Sarah's final message. Each character trembled on the screen. It had been 36 hours since it was sent. Every passing minute shrunk their chances of survival. As the sun dipped behind the Andes, Ethan climbed into a rusty pickup with Jorge. In his hand, a map of the Amazon rainforest with a red X at its center, marking the start of a journey between life and death. The plane touched down at Jorge Chavez Airport as Lima lay beneath a blanket of misty rain. Ethan pulled his luggage straight through immigration, barely glancing at his surroundings. Only one thought pounded in his mind: get to the jungle. Fast. At a worn-down cafe near the city center, he met Jorge Morales, a retired jungle rescue soldier now living in Pucallpa on the edge of the Amazon. Jorge had spent years in the depths of the rainforest, surviving cartel crackdowns and illegal logging raids. His mind held terrifyingly detailed maps of hidden trails and forgotten paths. Even satellites missed. Jorge studied the photo of Sarah and Emma, which Ethan laid beside a printed map with the final GPS coordinate marked in red. "This spot isn't part of any tourist area," Jorge muttered. "To get there, we'll need to go upriver, then trek by foot for another full day." "We don't have that kind of time," Ethan replied, his voice like steel. They set off the next morning in an old, sputtering pickup truck that clawed its way down slippery red dirt roads. Jorge talked as he drove. "The locals have been leaving their villages lately. Strange disappearances. But the authorities don't care. These people are just names on forgotten lists." As they neared Peachy's, the transitional zone between virgin forest and illegal logging territory, the first signs appeared. A broken signpost lay across the road. "Restricted area. Research project." Jorge frowned. This wasn't here last year. Someone put that up recently. The forest road ahead fell into eerie silence. No monkeys, no birds, just the stuttering hum of the engine cutting through a curtain of fog. Ethan peered out the window and caught sight of large tire tracks, fresh heavy from something like a military truck. They vanished into the underbrush as if the vehicle had been swallowed by the jungle. When they reached the GPS point, what appeared to be an abandoned eco-camp came into view. Torn canvas tents, rotting wooden frames, shattered signs. But strangely, nothing seemed looted. Everything was placed too neatly, almost as if staged. Inside the largest tent, Ethan stepped over damp leaves and approached a table littered with decaying scientific equipment, sample vials, temperature charts, and analysis sheets. On the floor lay a folder. He picked it up. The label read, "Cardiac Condition, Sample Group 12, Subject Female, 8 years old." His heart froze. Emma was 8. Hands trembling, Ethan flipped through the pages. Just a few lines, but enough to drown him in dread. Subject showing strong drug response. Dosage needs adjustment. Organ size compatible with Group A classification. Jorge entered just in time to see the report. His expression darkened. "This isn't an eco-camp, it's a biological testing site disguised as one." "Or something far worse," Ethan whispered. They moved through the rest of the camp. A few medical lockers were locked, but Ethan recognized the packaging of drugs commonly used in organ transplants. In a nearby unplugged portable cooler, he found bags of blood unlabeled, still cold to the touch. Jorge closed the door without a word. "I've seen this before, in Bolivia. A black market organ farm. They take victims from anywhere, process them, log data, extract what they need, then vanish." Ethan clenched his fists. "We're not just searching for my family, we're fighting a system." As they left the site near sunset, Jorge pointed to fresh footprints by a stream. "Not local," he said, "military boots. At least 3 people. They were just here." That night, in a makeshift tent pitched beneath twisted jungle trees, Ethan couldn't sleep. He turned over the puzzle pieces again and again. Sarah's message, the abandoned camp, the folder with his daughter's profile. It didn't add up. The information, which should have been straightforward, now contradicted itself, or worse, seemed deliberately misaligned. he began to suspect someone had been misleading them. Was this really the first time Sarah and Emma were being watched? Could someone have orchestrated this trip, pushed them into a trap disguised as a vacation? And why did this off-grid research station, absent from every official record, contain data specifically about his daughter? Peering through the flap of the canvas tent into the thick, unmoving dark, Ethan felt it again. Something watching. Not an animal. Not a man, but a presence silent, always one step ahead. And he knew from this moment forward each step he took wouldn't just be a search for his loved ones, it would be a fight for survival. A confrontation with something far more calculated than chance. From the edge of the abandoned campsite, Ethan and Jorge began their descent into the heart of the rainforest, a place with no maps, no signal, and almost no way back. The jungle wasn't just trees, it was alive, breathing, watching. A damp mist clung to their skin like sweat, and the ground beneath their boots felt freshly disturbed, as though something or someone had passed through not long before. The air was heavy, suffocating, and each breath felt like a struggle to find oxygen. Jorge, seasoned from decades surviving in the wild, led the way, his eyes scanning constantly. He stopped near a muddy depression, pointing at the ground. Military-grade boots, not locals. These are fresh. Beside them, a shallow drag mark veered into the underbrush. Someone had moved in a hurry or been dragged. As they pushed deeper, the anomalies multiplied. Near a massive tree, they found an empty syringe tossed among the leaves. The packaging was in Spanish sedative high dosage, typically used in unsanctioned surgeries. Ethan picked it up. Expiration just 2 months ago. Under the flashlight's beam, he spotted faint bloodstains darkened and dried on the bark. Not much, but enough to prove someone had been injured here. Jorge pressed a hand to the tree. Eyes narrowed. This was a pause point. They either stopped willingly or were stopped. The forest thickened. Every step meant fighting through dense vines, thorny underbrush, and leeches clinging to their ankles. Ethan's shirt was soaked, his breath ragged, but his eyes stayed sharp. He spotted something fluttering from a low-hanging branch, a torn strip of pink fabric delicate like a child's hair tie. His heart seized. He grabbed it, held it close to his chest. A golden strand of hair clung to it. Emma's. There was no doubt she had been here. Maybe she still was. Jorge motioned for silence. He pulled aside a thick curtain of leaves to reveal a flattened patch of earth, scattered with boot prints and faint embers. Someone camped here. See how the ground's compacted evenly, and that ash pile, makeshift fire pit. Ethan knelt beside the charred remains. Among the ashes, a half-burned sheet of paper caught his eye. The words were still legible. Completed harvest of subject. 4. Transport to point. D. A red circular symbol had been stamped near the bottom. A chill ran down his spine. They're harvesting people like crops, Ethan whispered. Nearby, they found half-buried trash bags. Carefully, they opened them, bloody gloves, used gauze, half-filled vials. But what made Ethan go pale was a small silver pendant tangled in leaves, a heart-shaped locket engraved with the name Emma. Silence fell between them. Jorge muttered something under his breath, maybe a prayer. Ethan barely spoke. She's alive. She has to be. Then the rain began, fat drops pounding the canopy above, crashing through the leaves and splattering mud across their boots. The air grew even thicker, and in the hazy downpour, Jorge suddenly pointed toward a flicker in the distance, a blinking light, 3 pulses, then darkness. Not lightning, not fire. LED, a signal. They know we're following, Jorge murmured. And they're warning each other. Ethan stepped back, instincts roaring. If they knew he was coming, he was no longer the hunter, he had become prey. One wrong move, and he and Jorge would vanish like the others before them. Without a word, Jorge grabbed Ethan and led him through a hidden path winding along a shallow stream. They marched in silence, soaked to the bone, until they reached a small rock overhang, temporary shelter from the storm. There, with the jungle howling and rain unrelenting, Ethan unrolled his hand-drawn map. Every clue, the cloth scrap, the blood, the pendant, the burned paper pointed toward one unmarked location deep in the forest, a place with no name, no record. Just a blank space, as though the world had chosen to forget it existed, and Ethan knew what awaited him. There wasn't just the people who'd taken his family. It was the truth, buried under years of silence and guarded by monsters who wore human faces. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thin veil of mist that hung between the trees like smoke. Ethan and Jorge pressed deeper into a region of the forest no map acknowledged. Each step forward brought them farther from the known world. Suddenly, a calm male voice rose from behind a thicket. "You won't find a way out this path, not without help." Both men turned instantly, Jorge's hand resting lightly on the hilt of his machete. Standing before them was an elderly man, weathered by sun, with thinning silver hair tucked beneath a canvas hat. He wore a loose faded coat and leaned on a walking stick. No weapon, no heavy gear, just steady, unreadable eyes. "My name's Elias," he said softly. "I've been a guide through this jungle for over a decade. Saw you two wandering and thought I might offer help." Jorge didn't loosen his grip. "A guide," he scoffed. "Out here in the middle of nowhere." Elias chuckled gently. "Once in a while, people come seeking solitude. But lately it's been quiet." Ethan studied the man's face. There was no direct threat in his tone, but no warmth either. His presence was oddly neutral unnervingly. So it felt as if this man knew far more than he let on. Jorge took a step forward, eyes sharp. "If you've lived around here, then you must have heard people have gone missing recently." Elias didn't flinch. "There are always stories, wild animals, hidden traps. Police don't care. No one really looks for the missing out here." Ethan suddenly remembered something. He pulled out a small worn notebook. Emma's it had been found inside a backpack left near the abandoned site. On one of the last pages in shaky handwriting was a drawing, a bearded old man holding a stick, beneath which Emma had scribbled, "He says he's helping." But his eyes don't smile. His heart thudded. He held the notebook open toward Jorge. Jorge scanned it quickly. His expression changed. Elias Jorge said darkly, "Did you meet a woman with brown hair and a little girl?" "Sarah and Emma." Elias lowered his head, adjusting his hat. "I've met a lot of people hard to remember names, but Emma does sound familiar." The air tensed. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stepped forward, gaze locked. "That's my daughter. My wife. They were taken. And I think you know what's really happening out here." Elias didn't move, just sighed. "If I knew, I'd have told someone, but knowing too much friends sometimes, it's a dangerous thing." Jorge motioned subtly to Ethan. They didn't trust him. Elias hadn't acted surprised or defensive, not like an innocent man. He looked like someone used to suspicion, like someone who'd buried secrets far below the surface. After a pause, Elias spoke again. "If you're looking for them, avoid heading northwest. There are people there who don't like visitors." "Why warn us?" Ethan asked, "if you have nothing to do with it." Elias shrugged. "I've seen men like you brave decent, and then they vanish." He turned and walked calmly away, swallowed by the mist and the smell of wet moss and rotting wood. Jorge narrowed his eyes, watching him disappear. That man knows more than he's telling, could be their scout or maybe a former worker. Ethan nodded. Emma drew him. She sensed something off. They quickly agreed not to follow Elias, but instead to go exactly where he'd warned them not to. Whatever he was protecting was likely at the center. As they moved forward, Jorge whispered, "The most dangerous man isn't the one with the gun. It's the one hiding in plain sight." And both men knew they weren't just navigating jungle now. They were navigating shadows that could speak, smile, and vanish, just like Elias, leaving behind nothing but unease. The jungle turned a strange shade of gray, no more sunlight piercing the canopy, only a heavy leaden sky looming over the thick foliage. Ethan and Jorge moved slower. Now, unease crawled beneath their skin. The birds had stopped singing. The forest fell into a silence too deep to feel natural. Ethan stepped over a twisted root, then blackness. No warning. No sound. Just a sudden, brutal strike to the back of the head that dropped him instantly. His senses collapsed. The forest disappeared, and all that remained was the faint echo of his slowing heartbeat. Time passed how much he couldn't tell minutes, hours. When Ethan awoke, the forest was still. The hum of insects filled the air, but the world around him was alien. His neck ached, his vision blurred, cold earth pressed against his back. He tried to move, muscles screamed, but he wasn't tied up. He could lift his arms. When he wiped his forehead, he felt a sting near his left arm. Pulling up his sleeve, he found a small, fresh needle mark. The skin was swollen, bruised. His pulse spiked. He'd seen this before. In clinical trials, a clear injection site. Something had been put in him while he was unconscious. He forced himself upright. His backpack was still nearby, but some gear was gone. His GPS, the map, the recorder. Every tracking device had vanished. Only a jungle knife and a water flask remained. Jorge was nowhere in sight. Panic flared, but Ethan forced it down. His training kicked in. First assess, second, observe, third survive. He turned toward a distant rustle, but it was just a monkey watching him with eerie stillness before vanishing into the canopy. Ethan staggered forward, relying only on instinct now. He had no idea how far he'd been moved, but deep down he knew going back wasn't an option. Whoever had drugged him might still be nearby, watching. 20 minutes passed before he smelled it. Blood. A faint, rusty tang carried on the breeze. He slowed his steps. The jungle floor had been disturbed recently. Mud swirled with dark red-brown streaks. He knelt, dipped a gloved finger into it, raised it to his nose. The smell was sharp, unmistakable. Human blood. Beside the stain lay a small, bloodied handkerchief, pink with tiny embroidered flowers. His breath caught in his throat. He'd seen it before. Sarah had stitched it by hand for Emma during a family camping trip years ago. Ethan scrambled to open the last remaining testing kit from his emergency gear. One blood sample, one test strip. He applied the stain to the strip and waited. Seconds later, the result appeared. O positive. Emma's blood type. His knees buckled. He gripped a tree for support. They'd brought Emma here. Maybe while he was unconscious. Maybe she'd been close, terrifyingly close. He scanned his body for any devices, no trackers, no wires. But something had been injected into him, a biological tracer, a neuromodulator. He didn't know. But he was certain of one thing now: he was being watched, not with cameras, but with science. He wasn't just searching anymore. He was part of the experiment. And what about Jorge? Had he escaped, or been taken too? There were no signs of struggle nearby, no second trail of blood. Maybe Jorge had fled, or maybe he'd been taken in another direction. The sky darkened. Ethan chose not to move any farther. He found cover beneath a bush and carefully buried the bloodied cloth and sample. If anyone came after him, they wouldn't get this evidence. This was proof of his daughter's presence, of her pain, of her survival. That night, hidden beneath thick vines and brush, Ethan didn't sleep. He listened. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth could be a predator animal or otherwise. And in that ink-black night, Ethan Monroe was no longer a biologist, no longer a desperate father. He was a marked subject, a variable under surveillance. And out there in the trees, something or someone was watching, patient, silent, waiting for his next move. As if studying a lab rat that had just woken up from its first injection. Night had fully fallen. The jungle lay shrouded in an impenetrable black, each canopy above swallowing what little light remained. Ethan crouched beneath a thick bed of rotting leaves, every muscle aching, but his nerves razor-sharp. He didn't dare sleep, didn't even dare breathe deeply. Every sense was tuned for survival. Then a soft sound broke the silence. 3 short whistles spaced exactly as he and Jorge had once agreed, an all-clear signal. He rose, eyes sharp, and flashed his mini red light once, then off a shadow approached from the darkness. It was Jorge. "They were going to take you," Jorge whispered. "I followed them. Couldn't act right away. I waited until they left, then circled back." Ethan gripped his friend's arm tightly. No words were needed. They both knew there was no more time. The infiltration had to happen tonight before the trail disappeared. Under the tangled canopy, they sat close around a torn forest map, circling the area where Emma's blood had been found and where suspicious movement had been detected. Jorge, with a memory like a compass, redrew every path and deviation they'd seen. Ethan added symbols marking disturbed brush-tied vines and deep boot prints leading west, the exact direction Elias had warned them to avoid. "That has to be the main camp," Jorge said grimly. They made a plan. At 11:00 p.m., they'd approach from the south, low terrain. Fewer tall trees, better visibility. One would film, one would plant GPS tags. A rough sketch of the camp would be drawn on-site evidence no one could ignore. The moon hung pale above the jungle. The breeze carried a faint mix of mildew and distant smoke, proof they were getting close. They crawled low, sliding over roots and dead leaves, freezing at the first flickers of light up ahead. Nestled in the brush, a cluster of tents and shacks rimmed with loose barbed wire. Men with flashlights patrolled silently, not soldiers, but disciplined. Jorge tapped Ethan's shoulder, pointing left, camera mounted in the tree. Ethan nodded. They changed direction, circling to a blind spot near the rear. Jorge pulled out a secure phone, non-networked local storage only. He began recording one large medical tent, a few shacks with strange lighting shadows moving behind thin curtains. Then it began the screams. Distant, muffled but raw, not one several guttural human. Ethan clenched his jaw hand on his blade. Jorge motioned for calm. They kept filming, tagging the locations of cameras, secondary entrances, water lines, even a trash pit behind the tents. Parked nearby was a small truck, its tailgate smeared with fresh blood. Ethan crawled toward the main tent. Through a slit in the fabric, he could see inside odd medical devices, fluid tanks, suction machines, surgical lamps. On a metal table lay a restrained man, wrists-bound mouth, stuffed with cloth body thrashing in agony. Beside him, a figure in gray scrubs adjusted a heart monitor. Jorge filmed silently. His expression darkened. "They're not treating anyone," he muttered. "They're processing humans like raw material." Not far from that tent stood a locked room, no traffic in or out, a keypad lock, red markings above the door, a six-pointed star slashed with black. Ethan recorded it quickly, then signaled retreat. On the way out, they planted reflective string markers to trace their route later. Once a kilometer out, they finally stopped. Jorge collapsed onto the ground, wiping his face with a trembling hand. "It's a factory," he whispered. "A factory for human bodies, and Emma could be inside." Ethan clutched the fresh sketch in his hand. His eyes burned with a mix of desperation and resolve. He knew what they had just seen would not only help find his daughter, it could expose a silent empire of cruelty built beneath the jungle's breath. They never spoke the words, but both men knew this would be their last chance to return. As Ethan folded the map and Jorge secured the camera, a sharp crack echoed behind them, a branch snapping under pressure. They froze. Too late. A spotlight burst through the trees, catching the glint of Ethan's shoulder. "Ali!" A voice shouted in Spanish, followed by the thunder of boots crushing through the underbrush. Ethan and Jorge bolted in opposite directions. Jorge tossed a small pouch filled with makeshift noise grenades to the left. A low blast lit up the forest floor, and the pursuers turned instinctively. That was all the opening Ethan needed. He sprinted uphill, clutching the memory card in his fist like it was his daughter's heartbeat. Behind him, Jorge shouted, "Go! I'll cover you!" then turned and charged toward the chaos. Ethan caught one last glimpse of him upright, fearless, facing the oncoming lights with the stance of a man who had already accepted the cost. Then he vanished into the trees. Screams followed. Metal clashed. Shouts echoed. a frenzy of sound cutting through the jungle like a knife, but Ethan couldn't turn back. Wouldn't. If he was caught, everything they had gathered would vanish with him. The map, the footage, the voices of the gray-coated men, the cries of the victims. All of it now lived inside a memory card barely the size of his thumb, and Jorge had given everything to protect it. Ethan stumbled across a stream, slammed into the mud, but never let go of the card tucked beneath his shirt. Rain began falling light at first, then steadier. Each drop slammed against his face like the thudding of loss. Jorge. The man who'd kept this mission alive when Ethan had nearly given up, he might be dead now, or worse taken. Nearly an hour passed before Ethan slowed. The sounds of pursuit had faded behind him. He found shelter beneath an outcropping of stone, crouched low, shivering. Not from cold, but from the hollowness taking over. He closed his eyes and replayed everything. The bound victims, the blood, the hidden lab, the wide, terrified eyes of a man strapped to a surgical table. Ethan couldn't let it be forgotten. He wouldn't let Jorge's sacrifice be in vain. When dawn broke, Ethan would leave this jungle, with the footage, with the truth. He crept back toward the old trail Elias had once appeared on. He didn't know if anyone still followed, but fear no longer controlled him. He pulled the memory card from his shirt and stared at it. "You are the truth," he whispered, "and I will bring you to the light." He didn't know if Jorge had survived. Didn't know if Emma was still inside the camp or already gone, but he understood something deeper. If he fell now, there would be no one left to speak. And that was when he realized what defeats darkness isn't firepower or vengeance. It's one person who refuses to forget, who dares to hold the truth, even if all they have is a single fragile sliver. By the time the sky turned pale and the birds began to call again, Ethan Monroe disappeared into the jungle like a ghost swallowed by shadow. Behind him, the forest sealed its secrets once more. In his hand, the memory card pulsed with silent fire, the last living ember of a man's sacrifice and a father's promise. The next morning, Ethan emerged from the jungle like a shadow, his face bruised, clothes, torn limbs covered in cuts and scrapes, but in his hand he still clutched the memory card, his only link to the hidden horrors that no one dared speak of. He didn't go to the police in Pucallpa. They couldn't help him. Instead, he walked to a rundown cafe near the riverbank and borrowed a local's battered laptop. With a trembling breath, he inserted the memory card. What he saw nearly made him drop the device. The first clip, a high-angle view of a remote jungle compound captured by Jorge's drone camera. 4 men in pale gray biosuits stood around a large truck. The rear door swung open to reveal several white plastic containers, each labeled with QR codes. One man opened a container inside vacuum-sealed human organs, livers, kidneys, hearts, preserved in industrial cooling gel. A masked man read from a checklist. The audio was disturbingly clear. Group A, ages 7 to 12, 3 hearts, 6 livers. Deliver to Delta Point within 48 hours. The hum of the cooler was steady, mechanical, like a synthetic heartbeat. Each word felt like a blade across Ethan's skin. He skipped ahead to a clip from Jorge's hidden backpack camera, shaky, but focused. Inside a makeshift medical tent, a woman strapped to a surgical table, gagged wrists, bound, her eyes wide with terror. Beside her, a masked technician prepared an injection. Nearby, a heart monitor beeped in rhythmic dread. Jorge had marked every frame, time-stamped, labeled with location angles, and the number of personnel present. Each video was a sliver of hell caught on tape. Then came the final file, a recording from a bug planted beneath a meeting table. A voice, European accent, calm and cold. The final shipment goes through Brazil, then Europe. The organization has prepaid. The Peruvian branch just needs to keep local authorities quiet. Another man laughed. Pucallpa's police are handled same as always. Some cash a health screening, and they look away. They mentioned names, Del Sol Foundation, Mercury Logistics Project, Vita, names that had surfaced before in leaked human rights documents, always suspected, never proven. Until now, Ethan leaned back in the chair. Pulse-pounding, Jorge had captured everything, every scream, every transaction, every shadowed face. It was no longer just footage. It was a declaration, Not just against a camp in the jungle, but against an international black market network trafficking organs under the veil of legality. He uploaded copies of the files to 3 trusted international news agencies, one in the US, one in Switzerland, one in Japan. He left no name, just a title in the email. Peru, jungle doesn't hide everything. He knew that once these images reached the world, silence would no longer be an option. But he also knew the cost of exposing such darkness could be his own life. And worst of all, through all the footage, all the voices, all the chilling evidence, there was still no sign of Emma. No face, no voice, no mention. It was as if his daughter had been swallowed whole by the dark without a trace. Ethan stood slowly, his heart heavier than ever. In his hand he held not just proof, but a torch, and it burned with the weight of those who couldn't speak for themselves. He stepped outside. The sun in Pucallpa scorched his skin, but he didn't flinch. Not anymore. Not when Jorge had died for this. Not when Emma might still be out there. And not while hundreds of silenced victims waited for someone to scream on their behalf. No more hiding. No more shadows. It was time for the world to see. One day after sending the footage, Ethan stood at the gates of the U.S. consulate in Lima. His face was hollow, his clothes torn, his body worn down. But in his hand, he held something more powerful than any weapon, the memory card. He didn't ask for asylum, he came with evidence. The card was handed directly to a CIA officer stationed in Peru under defense cooperation. When the first frames played on the briefing room screen, no one in the room spoke. One agent quietly stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, dialing straight to Washington. This wasn't just a trafficking ring. Within 3 hours, under U.S. pressure, the embassy pushed for joint action with Peruvian authorities. A rapid response task force was assembled that night. 4 U.S. agents, 7 Peruvian soldiers, 1 forensic doctor, and Ethan, the sole witness and only person who knew the way back into the jungle compound. They moved at 3:00 a.m. The forest was a black void, but each operative moved like clockwork. Ethan led them through the trails past the stream where Jorge had made his last stand toward the site where floodlights had once cut through the darkness. But the lights were gone. They knew the press had started asking questions. The ones behind the camp knew someone had survived. When the raid hit, there were no gunshots. Most of the perpetrators had already fled. What remained was chaos. Smashed equipment, half-burned documents, doors left wide open in a feeble attempt to erase their crimes. But they were too late. In a small shack behind the main tents tucked near the cliffside, lay Sarah bound with an oxygen mask strapped to her face, unconscious, but alive. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, hands trembling as they touched her cheek. Her eyelids fluttered open, a weak smile. "Emma?" she whispered. That was her first word. The task force swept the camp. They found 3 other victims, 2 men, 1 woman drugged, shackled in shock, but there was no sign of Emma. A notebook was recovered in the surveillance hut. It listed transport schedules and something far more sinister, a roster of live trials. On the last page, 1 name was circled in red. Ethan's hands shook as he held it. "EM, it could be no one else." Emma Monroe. Rage surged through the soldiers. They tore open the final warehouse door, revealing crates of unopened drugs, medical devices, and biometric tracking tools far beyond what the initial footage had shown. But still no Emma. One agent turned to Ethan, voice cold. They moved her before they ran. Ethan didn't cry, didn't scream. He only clenched his fists until his knuckles went white. A medevac helicopter waited to evacuate the victims. Sarah was stabilized and loaded onto a stretcher. Even then she asked, "Did you find her?" Ethan leaned close. "I will." He turned back to the smoldering ruins of the camp. The world would now see the faces behind the gray coats. International media had begun receiving the evidence. Human rights groups had issued statements. But Ethan knew darker places still existed, places even deeper in the jungle, and Emma might be there. As the helicopter lifted, Ethan stayed behind. He joined the team decoding the next transport points. From the scattered maps and encrypted files, a new location emerged further north, beyond the satellite grid, a place no one had mapped, Emma was still alive, and Ethan had only one mission left. Subject number 12 must be brought home, even if he had to burn the whole forest down. 4 days after the jungle raid, Ethan arrived in Iquitos, a town buried deep in the Amazon basin, inaccessible by road, surrounded only by rivers and clouds. There, a biomedical tracker Jorge had secretly implanted in a shipment container had begun transmitting. The signal led to a decaying facility now operating under the guise of a tropical immunology research center. U.S. agents were ready to breach, but Ethan made one request: let me go in alone. He knew who was inside. The steel doors creaked open into a cold concrete lab that reeked of bleach and something far fouler. From the shadows stepped a man with silver hair, a pristine white lab coat streaked faintly with blood. Ethan, the man greeted with a thin smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." Ethan clenched his fists. "Walter Kramer, I should have known." Walter, his former colleague. Once the lead researcher on a 2015 immune response project, a brilliant mind, and the same man who was quietly ousted after allegedly leaking sensitive genetic data from highland Peruvian communities. Walter stepped forward, eyes gleaming with a sick pride. "I've only accelerated evolution, Ethan. Can't you see? We're refining the human body using biology to elevate those who can afford it. I selected the women, the children, the healthiest. I turned them into assets." Ethan's voice was ice. "Where's my daughter?" Walter tilted his head. Subject number 12. She was promising. "But you're too late." A soft click echoed behind Ethan. A guard had entered gun-drawn, aiming straight at him. "You're the last loose end," Walter said calmly, "and I can't let the data in your head walk free." Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Jorge's voice played in his earpiece, a final recording he'd hidden in Ethan's jacket. "Walter fears exposure. If cornered, he'll try to explain himself. He always wants someone to understand his vision." Ethan opened his eyes, steady cold. "You know what, Walter? I've got a full confession, your voice, your orders to Elias, your lists of high-altitude women and children, and most importantly, my daughter's name on a trial roster." Walter flinched. "What?" Ethan stepped forward. "It's all recorded. Interpol is listening as we speak. Any move you make now just seals your fate." The guard hesitated, looked at Walter. Walter backed away, his eyes unraveling. You can't do this." Ethan pulled a small recorder from his jacket, pressed play. Walter's own voice filled the room. "Latest list from Cajamarca Clinic. 6 girls, 4 healthy women. Moved them to Delta site next week." Walter lunged, but the guard was faster. He grabbed Walter, slammed him to the floor. Moments later, the lab door burst open. U.S. agents swarmed in and pinned him down. Ethan stood still, gasping for breath. The man behind it all, the scientist, the traitor, the architect of suffering, was finally exposed. As they cuffed Walter and dragged him out, he glanced back. No longer smug, just hollow desperate, maybe even silently begging for forgiveness. Ethan didn't blink. He walked out of the lab into the golden light rising over the Amazon. But the darkness hadn't lifted, not yet. Emma was still missing. But now, Ethan had names, roots, the very web Jorge and Sarah had given everything to reveal. And he swore, if it meant descending into the blackest depths of hell, he'd bring his daughter back. The rain was relentless. The Madre de Dios River churned thick with red sediment, as if hiding ancient truths beneath its current. Ethan trudged through the muck, every step pulling at his legs, following the final biomedical signal implanted in one of the high-value subjects. It led him to a crude structure at the forest's edge near the Bolivian border. No guards, no lights. Only the patter of rain on tin roofs and the faint scent of disinfectant clashing with mildew. The first room was empty. The second wasn't. A small figure lay curled on a single cot. Frail hair matted one arm, clutching her stomach in reflexive protection. Ethan didn't enter right away. He stood still, breath caught. That face, eyes closed, unmoving, was burned into his soul. "Emma," he whispered. She didn't respond, but her eyelids flickered. A soft moan escaped like a voice clawing its way up from a well of silence. Ethan rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the bed. A military doctor followed, checking her pulse, flashing a light into her pupils. "She's alive," he said quietly, weak but stable, heart still strong, reflexes intact. Ethan grasped his daughter's hand, his chest heaving. Emma was thinner, paler, but it was the mole on her left wrist. The tiny scar from the bike fall when she was 9. She was Emma, and she had survived. 3 days later, they were airlifted back to Lima. A secure military hospital took them in. Emma's identity was locked under layers of encryption, Ethan's name scrubbed from every known network, because now he wasn't just a father who had found his child. He was the cornerstone of a global operation. The Golden Hand campaign had begun. Walter's confession unraveled trade routes and funding networks. Over 70 biotech executives were flagged. Offshore accounts froze shell companies in Dubai, Switzerland, and Kenya began to crumble. At WHO summits, quiet murmurs turned into public outcry. Meanwhile, footage of organ shipments played behind closed-door briefings. And in the middle of it all sat Ethan, quiet, hollow-eyed, not from fatigue, but from knowing the truth he'd unearthed was only a fraction of the whole, a fragment of a much deeper abyss. A month later, Ethan and Emma boarded a plane home. Sarah, still recovering, would join them later. On the way to the airport, Ethan looked out at the forests receding behind him, unrest still flickering in his chest. "We won a battle," he thought, "but the war's still coming." The jet roared into the clouds below. The world grew smaller. But elsewhere, something moved. A small truck rolled across the southern border, its cargo sealed in plain containers. Inside the taillight, housing a hidden camera, recorded the driver-gloved hands and a serpent tattoo coiled around a golden hand. The network still breathed. By the riverside, a boat waited, another shipment preparing to vanish from Peru's soil. And somewhere in Europe, in a glass-walled boardroom, a man in a black suit sipped red wine, his fingers tracing a new list, Subject 13. He wasn't reading names. He was forecasting bodies. And so the fight had only just begun.